Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Jack Kerr. I'm the event coordinator with the Willie Street Co-op. Today is the first of 5 sessions that we're going to be doing, a Q&A gardening format, and we're lucky enough to have Ben Futa with us. He is the former director for Allen Centennial Gardens on campus and the host of a PBS program called Let's Grow Stuff. We trust that he can answer all of the many questions that you may have and some of those that have come into us. So today's format is going to be a short presentation from Ben, and then we're going to kind of break it up between questions that we've received by email and questions that you may have, which you can enter into the chat at any time. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Ben. Let's get started.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jack, and good morning, everyone, and to those who are tuning in right now. Well, maybe I'll do a little bit of an extended intro here to give people a few more minutes to log in and get their caffeine flowing. So again, as Jack mentioned, I am recently of Madison, Wisconsin. So my partner and I just moved back home here to Indiana a few months ago, but most recently I was the director of Allen Centennial Garden at UW-Madison. And so of course, know the co-op well and know the Madison horticulture scene pretty well. So the first topic we have this morning will be this concept of really getting started as a gardener. And so I'm going to cover a lot of different, both growing food and growing ornamentals. We're going to sort of dabble in both. We're going to cover just a little hair of philosophy because I can't do any program without starting with a few big ideas. And then we'll really get into some meat and sort of, again, answer your questions and look at a few technical things for really how to be successful as a gardener. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and we're going to, oh, Jack, it looks like you need to enable screen sharing there for me real quick.
Sure. Yes. All right, it should work now.
Perfect, yes. All right. So again, just a quick sort of overview of my sort of own horticultural background. Of course, I've been a lifelong gardener, again, growing and gardening here in South Bend. My first internship was in Chicago in the Lurie Garden here in Millennium Park. That's the picture you see on the lower right. So this really incredible, about 3-acre garden, all herbaceous perennials in the city. A really fantastic space. And then that took me to Fernwood Botanical Garden, which is just north of us here in Niles, Michigan. And again, most recently, Allen Centennial Garden at UW-Madison. So been gardening for many years, have been a plant nerd for most of those. And again, so these are sort of the experiences that we'll bring to bear this week, but also through the next 5 weeks as well as we cover some various topics. So as I mentioned, I always like to start with just a little bit of sort of big picture thinking anytime we talk about gardening, but sort of as we start to drill down into some of these ideas, because, I've seen various numbers, but something around like between 16 and 20 million people started gardening last year in 2020, sort of motivated by the pandemic. And this is a quote that I've used in presentations for several years. From Martin Luther King Jr., but particularly after last year, coming out of last year and into this year, this seems like relevant on many levels. And it's something that I always sort of keep in the back of my own brain as I do my own gardening. But this idea of accepting finite disappointment, but never losing eternal hope. I think no phrase maybe better encapsulates what the gardening experience is than this. This idea that, no matter what happens, things may not grow exactly as we think. There may be a pest or disease that moves in that sort of keeps us on our toes. The one year the rabbits will eat all your green beans. These moments happen, but there are also these really beautiful moments of when you actually have your first green bean harvest, or when you harvest your first cut flowers, or when you see your first hummingbird coming to your plantings. All of these are those hopeful moments that really define, I think, what the feeling of what gardening is. And so with that in mind, I think any sort of, no matter where you're gardening, no matter how you're gardening, starting with this idea of why you're gardening. And if you have a strong why, you'll find that it helps to first of all sort of help you know where to go for the resources you need, but also help you to go to garden centers or nurseries or wherever you may acquire your plant material, and sort of be able to focus, because it's very easy to walk into a garden center and just sort of walk out with 20 more things than you expected to purchase. Speaking from very personal experience. And so thinking about, we can garden for food, certainly productive gardening. We can garden for the beauty, the aesthetic of gardening, sort of the ornamental qualities. Gardening for utility could be things like medicinal plants, certainly to support wildlife, our own personal wellness. It's fun, of course. Gardening to build community, whether you're actually growing in a quote unquote community garden, or if you're simply growing in your front lawn and this is an opportunity to engage your neighbors and people living around you. And of course, gardening can be good for our environment, and we'll cover really all of these different whys in bits and pieces through the next few minutes. But again, one of these is not exclusive to the other. You can certainly have a garden that does all of these things if you want to cast that net. But again, think about this why essentially as your filter as you're moving into gardening. And just because you started in one doesn't mean you can't branch out. Also, the puns in gardening are endless. Doesn't mean you can't branch out into another. Something else that I think is worth saying, especially these days, is that really gardening is sort of the process is the product. I think a lot of us are, we see images maybe like the one on the bottom of this screen of, the magazine ready photo spread, or, we all have had those moments of, going down the Pinterest rabbit hole of, seeing these beautiful, lush, amazing gardens, and we aspire to those. And that's certainly not a bad thing to look for inspiration and to aspire to grow that way. But at the same time, that is a moment in time. And there are so many more moments that look like the above photo than look like the photo below. So the actual process of making a garden and putting the pieces together, this was our old garden in Madison before we moved. And, it's, again, much to my partner's discontent some days, this was sort of always a work in progress. You can see the pile of materials there against the garage. You can see essentially straight ahead, that was compost for a time before I had a more of a true sort of compost pile. So, it's very easy to walk into a garden center or page through Pinterest and think that an HGTV has sort of triggered us a little to think that, this all happens instantly, and it just doesn't. Gardens are living, breathing, moving things. They are not static, but that is what's so beautiful. And I think so many people turn to gardening this past year, maybe as a way of thinking, certainly maybe growing food, thinking about reducing pressure on the food system, but also as a pastime, as a thing to do, as a way to keep busy, as a way to beautify their space, as all of us were at home. And so again, realizing that this process is where a lot of that beauty happens, more so than simply sort of the magazine spread that we, again, we'll see most often if we're looking in garden media. So with this in mind, again, that's sort of my soapbox philosophy moment. Again, just sort of setting the stage for what's coming, but now let's actually dig in. Let's start talking about some of these in a bit more detail and how we approach beginning as a gardener. So this looks complex. So take a deep breath. We're going to walk through this. But really, this is an example of what we call a site inventory. And so as the name sort of implies, this is a quick and easy way to get to know the site you're growing in. Because of course, outdoors, there are more factors at play than maybe when we're, certainly indoor growing has its mix of factors, but it's easier to control. You can decide, what plants are close to a window, which are away from an air vent. It's just, you're growing in a more controlled environment on the indoors, but the outdoors, of course, there's more happening, there's more movement. And so this type of illustration is something anyone could do at home. Again, we're not looking for high quality art. This is essentially, again, taking stock of what we have and where we are. And so you can see on the left there, the person who sort of did this example noted a lot of really important things. So certainly, we want to pay attention to three things sort of above and beyond all. And the first is sun exposure. So where does the sun move throughout the day? How many out, especially if you're looking to grow something like veggies, they really need a lot of sun. And so being able to identify where those full sun areas are. Also, especially this year, if this is something you're going to be doing in the next couple of weeks, you know, we have just bought a house here in South Bend, and I'm looking at the backyard going, wow, it's full sun. And then wait, there's a tree in my neighbor's yard that, as I look at the shadows cast by the branches, will actually be in shade, you know, some areas of the yard. So just again, remembering that we have seasons. I know this may sound very obvious to say, but it's very easy to say, well, I have a full sun yard, I'll just start planting and getting ready. But really taking time, and again, this image doesn't necessarily include your neighbors. So again, with that idea in mind as well, what might be happening next door to you that could influence what you're able to grow and how you're able to grow. So also noting things like utility poles and overhead power lines, which is important if you'll be planting any trees. Looking at where water drains to. So do you have areas of your yard that collect water after rain? Again, digging in just a few inches even to sort of get to know your soil. Is it heavy clay? Is it, again, sort of as they're noting here, the shallow and rocky soil that's sort of gravelly? And also thinking about, and this is, I think, something maybe we don't think about as much as we could, the views from indoors. And so this particular plan, all of these sort of V-shaped with arrows that you're seeing, this person is calling out the views, you know, sort of how do we bring the outdoors in, essentially. So that center area up there where it says hot, you know, that's probably a patio or a deck, I would imagine. You can see there's a lot of windows and a lot of views looking into this space. And so whatever we do in there is going to be seen from 3 different angles. So there really isn't a back. There isn't a place we can hide something maybe that we don't want to. This isn't the place to put your compost unless you really want to see your compost every day. But again, maybe off to the lower right, you can notice on this particular image, there aren't really any views down in that area. So this type of exercise is helpful to start thinking about where you want to place what you want to grow, which is what we'll sort of look at here moving forward. And this, I think, really builds into this idea of what we call right plant, right place. And this is a concept that has certainly been in horticulture for many years, but I think it's something that a lot of us, both seasoned gardeners and beginning gardeners, we forget this. And I think it's something that, you know, because we want to grow something specific. Again, our last house in Madison, we had this huge, big, beautiful tree in the backyard, which basically made the entire backyard shade. I really wanted to try to grow food, but really quickly realized my options were going to be limited to veggies that can handle a bit of a lower light condition. You know, I wasn't going to be able to do corn and tomatoes. I was really looking at things like kale and greens, and rhubarb did great in part sun, actually. So it's essentially this notion relates to matching the right plant to your site conditions rather than saying, well, I want to grow veggies and I need full sun, so I'm just going to cut this tree down. You know, first of all, that's a huge investment, both in time and money. You know, that tree is a carbon sink. It's sequestering carbon. It's providing habitat for wildlife and birds. It's cooling, you know, maybe cooling your home, cooling the neighborhood. It's performing a lot of important functions. And so, you know, as we go back to this site inventory, now that we sort of understand what our site has, what we have to work with, thinking about, again, where we plug in those things that we want to do that meet our why. We go back to that big why. So let's say we want to grow herbs. We want to grow plants that have utility, that are edible. Well, herbs, most of them, not all, but most are sort of Mediterranean native. So they like hot, they like dry, they like good drainage. So this sort of patio area where it's really hot, they will probably do very well in this condition. However, the lower left-hand side of this site where it says rain garden there, that would not be the place for herbs. Herbs do not like standing water. They're not gonna, again, that soil may be heavier down there because if it doesn't drain terribly quickly. So again, we can start to, again, sort of match up roughly where we want our things to go, again, based on the site that we have. So this is sort of matching the right plant to the right place, essentially. And I want to extend this a little bit deeper into really understanding what you're growing. And this doesn't mean you have to become, you know, the world's most amazing plant expert or most horticultural guru, but it really comes down to just doing a little bit of due diligence based upon what you want to grow. And this image, it's sort of, we've probably all either been there or seen this happen, where somebody at some point planted a big shade tree underneath a power line. And of course, as that tree grew, they've had to sort of cut the middle of the tree out. Again, time, work, it's not suiting the natural habit of the tree. It's could, if they can't get to pruning in time, it could cause other issues further down the line. So, versus also, I've many times seen where, well, that tree is cute now, it's only 3 feet tall, I'll put it 3 feet away from my house. Fast forward 5 to 7 to 10 years, and suddenly that tree is eating your house and you have to take it out. Certainly part of that is the learning curve of gardening, but especially if you're thinking about investing in something like a tree or a fruit tree or anything like that, understanding how large they get and making sure that matches the site and the space that you have. So again, going back to this site inventory, we wouldn't want to plant trees underneath power lines. That's another really important reason to note where those are on your site, and that can help you sort of determine where some of these plants can go. So another thing, and this is dabbling into ornamental plants a little bit, and again, we're going to kind of waffle between ornamental growing and veggie growing here. But as you're growing, and this certainly could apply to veggies to some degree, but something I like to think about, especially if you're buying perennials for the first time, is taking what we call the rabbit's eye view. So essentially, this means looking at the point where the plant meets the soil, where the leaves and the roots, right at that soil line. And how a plant grows in a nursery container will tell you a lot about how it will grow when it actually gets into your garden. Because, certainly we have plant labels and they will say this plant gets 3 feet tall, 3 feet wide, and likes full sun. Great, those are the basics, but that doesn't tell us how that plant will spread over time. It doesn't tell us, we might put something in and in 3 years be cursing ourselves because now we have to rip it all out because it's been too aggressive or something like that. So taking this rabbit's eye view is a great way to sort of at a quick glance understand how something's going to perform as you bring it into your garden. And so first, we'll talk grasses. So there are 2 types of grass forms, and the first are what we call cespitose. And this image that we're looking at here is tufted hair grass. And there's a few clues in the name. First, that tufted, it actually refers to sort of that being a tight tufted clump. But also the Latin name, if you're looking at that plant label, the Latin name of this plant is Discampsia cespitosa. So cespitose is actually embedded in the name. And those Latin names tell us a lot about how a plant will grow and how it behaves. But again, if you're looking at this plant in a nursery container, if you just sort of peel back the leaves and again, look right at that soil line, you'll see a nice tight clump of growth. And that again is your first clue that, okay, this plant isn't going to spread vegetatively. So it's not going to send out runners and roots and start popping up all over your garden and your lawn. It's basically going to stay where we put it. And that if that's something you want, this is sort of that mental file to make. Versus, of course, the opposite, non-cespitose grasses. And so these, the best example of these probably all of us are familiar with are lawn and turf grasses. So turf grass is chosen specifically because it spreads underground. It sends out lateral runners, and that's how it spreads. It forms these dense mats. But as we're thinking about bigger grasses, say native grasses or things that we may be growing for more ornamental value, again, these are plants that will spread and mingle over time. Some, again, more aggressively than others. But again, as you look at this nursery pot, you can see those aren't growing in a really tight clump already. They've started to spread out within the pot. And another really telltale sign of a spreading plant in a nursery container is, especially if it's maybe been in that pot for more than a year, is you'll see that the roots have started to encircle the outer ring, and that's where all of the plant stems are coming up. So if you see a nursery pot and all of the plants are sort of growing along that outer ring, it's a spreader. And again, doesn't mean you can't buy it. This doesn't mean these plants are bad. It's just knowing what you're bringing in and how it's going to behave so that you're not, again, shocked or again, just know what you're getting yourself into, essentially. And again, this native grass, this is just an example of sort of what's happening underneath with these non-cespitose plants. So again, this isn't lawn turf, but this is essentially how turf works. It sends out these lateral horizontal stems, and that's how it will spread in many ways. Again, this is true of course, grasses, but also just flowering plants and perennials. So the alliums on the left, nice tight clumps. On the right, we see bee balm. Both of these are familiar plants, fairly common, easy to acquire. Again, the monarda, the bee balm on the right, if you pick that up in a nursery plant or in a nursery container, those roots are probably going to be encircling the outer edge of the pot. Again, doesn't mean you can't grow it, just know what you're getting into as you do. So again, with these in mind, asking yourself, how might these plants spread as you get them into your space? Are they something that's going to reseed? Is it something that's going to spread, again, vegetatively by sending out roots or runners? Sort of a quick way to know if a plant might be more prevalent to reseed. Certainly perennials do, but annuals, because they complete their life cycle in a single season, are going to be more likely to reseed, reseed within your garden. Certainly you can collect seeds and replant them yourself, but these are the plants that are more likely to volunteer themselves and start popping up in various places. But also, this is, and again, this isn't to say any of this is bad. This is coming to know what you're growing. If there's anything you have doubts about, especially as you're just getting started, you can always deadhead, which basically means taking those spent blooms off of the plant, and that'll prevent it from seeding out. However, if you're gardening for wildlife, so if one of your goals is to support not only pollinators when the flowers are blooming, but say birds that like to eat things like coneflowers and sunflower seeds, remember they need and want those seeds. So if you want to see those beneficial wildlife coming to your space, leaving those seeds is an important factor. But then also, if they're eating all of them, they're not going to be popping up in your garden. So it's sort of a give and take in those circumstances. If you are growing plants that spread vegetatively, again, underground, sending out those runners, think about a physical barrier to sort of keep them in line. And especially if you're growing, say, herbs or functional plants, mint, I'm looking at you here. This would be things like spearmint, peppermint. Not all mints are created equal. Some mints mind their space. The more ornamental ones will mind their space very well, but others will spread. And fairly, one year they'll be here and the next year they'll be almost 2 feet over. They can move very, very quickly, especially in loose soil that's been amended and has a lot of compost. So you can think about burying a bucket, you can plant them against a sidewalk, something like physical edging, or actually putting them in a raised container that is, say, on a patio or a deck, where they simply can't escape. So they're essentially fully contained. And the final thing I'll say on sort of, getting to know how your plants will behave is exercise a little caution when you might have some donated plants. And there's a few reasons for this. In Madison in particular, and in our area, jumping worms are sort of a relatively new aggressive pest that has entered the area. And one of the primary ways they spread is through soil that's shared between gardeners. It can also spread through mulch and compost. We'll talk about these in a bit. That's one sort of risk factor of sharing plants. But the other side of this is if someone has too much of something, there's a reason. So it either means that it's a more aggressively growing plant. Again, it may be one of these fast spreading plants, and it could potentially, it will probably do the same thing in your garden to some degree. So again, just because someone is offering doesn't mean you have to say yes. It's sometimes okay for plant material to hit the compost pile. That's fully acceptable. But again, at the same time, if someone's offering you something, do a little research, understand what it is, how it grows, where it grows. And again, that as long as you know what you're getting yourself into, that's the biggest thing. And again, quick Google searches are one way to do this. And we'll look at a few other resources here in a second. As I was putting this presentation together, my iTunes or Pandora, whatever I was listening to, happened to be on shuffle, and I just had this moment of realization where if you need to remember this, or you need a gentle reminder, go to Whitney Houston, and the lyrics from her song "How Will I Know" sort of get into this. Don't trust your feelings, and love can be deceiving. So again, just because you love your neighbor or your friend, or you fall in love with something in a garden center, those feelings may be deceiving. That plant may be more aggressive or be more than you're really ready to get into. So just, again, know what you're growing before you really jump in. So again, to get to know these plants on this deeper level, because again, plant tags will only give you so much information. They won't tell you, all of these, all the ins and outs. Certainly, especially in Madison and the surrounding area, we have a wealth of incredible botanical gardens, all of which are staffed by knowledgeable experts. They all love to talk plants. So visiting these spaces, first of all, you can connect with a human, an actual person, and ask, how does this grow for you? Tell me about this. That's what they're there for. That's what we love to talk about. Ask us. But also, you can see how some of these plants perform in the long term. So you can almost go to your botanical gardens as a way to make your plant list before you go shopping, rather than just viewing things online or, again, in nursery pots, because you'll say, oh, wow, that's really spread, and that's a big drift of something. I wonder if I actually want to grow that, or if that's the look I want. The Missouri Botanical Garden has created a fabulous and amazing online plant database. And I mean, they have this level of detail. They go deep and far beyond just the basic plant tag. So, if you have your smartphone on you, you're walking through a nursery, you find something you really like, do a quick Google search and look for Missouri Botanical Gardens Plant Finder. It's usually in the top, 1 to 3 or 5 search results. And you scroll down to the bottom of the page, they usually have a few paragraphs that talks in depth about how the plant will grow over time. So that's another great resource. Again, of course, shopping at a local and independent nursery or garden center. Big box stores, it's a hit and miss whether or not you'll sort of have plant knowledge there. But of course, we also want to support local business. And so, how you get cool plants, how you get unique and interesting things are from these local and independent retailers. So supporting them, first of all, supporting them so they can keep providing you with awesome plants, but also they're going to probably be far more knowledgeable, and this is their passion. So really lean into them. You can also consult, there are garden coaches and horticultural experts out there who, again, can do a half-hour Zoom with you one-on-one and answer questions you might have. When in doubt, you can also check the state DNR has an invasive species list. It's specifically called the DNR NR40. And so, this isn't, again, not a bad thing. You can print it out, you can have it on your phone and bring it with you when you go to the garden center, because unfortunately, there are especially big box stores. There will be a lot of plants on this list that are still being sold. Just because they're on this list doesn't mean they aren't available in the trade, unfortunately. And so if something is on this list, first of all, we know it's on this list because it's likely escaped our gardens or our landscapes, and it's causing some degree of impact or harm in natural ecosystems. And so, we don't want to promote that happening, certainly. But also, we may already have some of these plants if you're inheriting a garden from somebody else. If you, again, the house I just bought, I'm noticing several of these plants that were planted here before we got here. And so, this may be something you're already contending with and don't know you have. So know what you're growing applies to things you may be purchasing and bringing in, but also things you might have inherited from a previous homeowner or previous gardener. So again, consulting that list is a great way to know. All of these are great resources to consult. I want to sort of share a note of caution, again, to beware of advertisements like this that you might see. Your first tip, that this is maybe not a reputable source, is the first line, I think, where, are you planning to grow plants in your garden? Well, what else might I grow? That's sort of your first signal. Second of all, this is sort of, I will say, a color not found in nature. This sort of iridescent cotton candy pink, this is Pepto-Bismol pink. This is, very few plants, this is a natural color for them. But again, if you have that invasive plant list next to you, you would very quickly see that this is on that list. And so, yeah, you could order seeds. Yeah, they'll grow really well, but they can also escape your lawn or your garden very easily, especially if you're growing in an area that's that's not in the city, but maybe out in a more rural setting where you have wild spaces nearby. This is just something, again, I would stay away from things like these, or exercise caution when you see these ads pop through your newsfeed. So our final couple of movements here. First is thinking about how do you set yourself up for success as you're getting started gardening. This is my backyard. Again, the moment the ground thawed, I was out. I was going, to actually make space and get rolling. So here are just, again, a few things to think about as you're growing. If you're growing food, getting a soil test is almost a necessity. And so there's a few reasons for this. The first is it just sort of really opens up your soil for you, because a great garden is built on great soil, for growing food, I should say. So from a soil test, you'll learn things like what's your pH balance, but you could certainly get an at-home pH test kit and do this as well. Most veggies, not all, but most, like a fairly neutral pH, so between maybe 6.5 and 7.5. So you'll get to learn that. You'll also learn about your nutrient balance. So is there anything your soil might be deficient in that you could add that could help balance things out? But maybe most importantly, you will also learn if there are any toxic chemicals in your space. And so this could be things, again, especially if you're growing in the city, especially if you're growing near a house in the ground, you could have, if lead paint maybe flecked off your house in the past and maybe in the soil. If you're growing on an old or abandoned lot, you just never know what was there before you were. And so this will pull out and say, things like lead or arsenic or just heavy metals that could still be in your soil. Plants will absorb those, and you don't want to eat those. That is not a good thing. So doing a soil test is really important before you get started. Also considering, again, plants absorb what we put out, they pull in, and then we pull into us. And so if you're using something like grass clippings to mulch your garden, that's great because they are high in nitrogen. They will feed the soil. They'll break down quickly. They're free. They're fairly, affordable. But if you apply fertilizers or pesticides to your lawn, which again, I wouldn't recommend anyway, if you're harvesting those grass clippings and putting them on your garden, well, that's all, it's all connected. And so you don't want to consume those. Again, just thinking about, what you apply directly to your veggies, but also maybe what you're applying indirectly. Again, this is true of accepting grass clippings from a neighbor, understanding how they care for their lawn, something important and to keep in mind. If you're growing on a balcony, this is amazing, but again, what goes up must come down. As you carry pots up that are empty, of course, they will be lighter than when they're full of soil and they're wet. And so again, if you are planning to move soon, or you may not be there for a long period of time, just keep this in mind that there will be an installation and there will be a deinstallation. And again, this doesn't mean you can't grow certain things, but just bearing in mind that, again, whatever you bring up, think about one day may have to come down. And finally, thinking about the amount of time in the day you have to commit to doing this. As we're emerging from the pandemic, some of us may go back to offices, some of us may stay working from home, and it's easy for us to spend 15 or 20 minutes in the garden every day, over our lunch break or to take a break. But just thinking about the time you have to commit and realizing that veggies in particular need fairly regular attention. Perennials and native plants to some degree, once they're set and growing, there is no such thing as a no maintenance garden. I'll say that right and say that right away. But there are degrees of management that you can sort of opt into or opt out of. And so just knowing what you're able to commit and what feels good for you, thinking about, you can be really ambitious in the spring, and a lot of us are. Again, you saw my backyard being torn up. Well, talk to me again in August, and hopefully, we'll still be in a good place with that. But I know I'm excited. I'm ready to do it. But again, just keep your schedule in mind as you're moving forward. Another resource, again, Jack mentioned this sort of in the intro here, but if you're, especially as a gardener getting started, for the last now year, we're going into season 2. We've been hosting a web series with PBS Wisconsin called Let's Grow Stuff. And so if you visit pbswisconsin.org/Let's Grow Stuff, these are short, quick episodes and videos. There's a blog as well with some tips and tricks. Again, these are, you shouldn't need to break out the notepad for these. These are quick and easy things and ways to learn some of these beginning gardener techniques. And so again, keep following us. You can follow PBS Wisconsin to follow these. All of these episodes are archived and free online as well as another great resource for beginning gardeners. And then the final movement here before we open up to questions is sort of what I like to call Mythbusters. Again, this idea of some things that maybe we've been taught or sort of culturally inherited about gardening that isn't necessarily the best way to operate. And so as we think about, essentially this section is informed by the idea of gardening with nature rather than against it. And so this first one is something that me and colleagues have talked about for years, this idea of plants are social. Plants like to be close to one another. And, you know, before last year, I would use examples like, imagine if I told you you could never be hugged by another human being again, how would you feel? Guess what? We've all had this collective experience for the last year, for better or worse. And this is what we do. We are essentially, when we plant like this image, when we do plant with a sea of mulch in between, it is quarantine lockdown forever. We all are ready to be over this. We're all ready to be through this. So if you're looking at your, you know, this, I hope, you know, of one of the potential positive outcomes of this shared experience for us, I hope we can turn our eyes to the outdoors and recognize what, you know, build a little empathy for our plants, essentially. So we don't want to plant this way. We don't want to plant plants in a perpetual pandemic lockdown. Let's think about planting plants together in communities in a way that they are social and intermingling and together with one another. And, you know, rather than, you know, using mulch, again, mulch is a way certainly to suppress weeds, to maintain soil moisture. You know, sometimes it's to improve soil fertility, but typically it's the first two reasons. But, you know, plants do their own mulching very well. You know, go to any natural ecosystem, a prairie, a meadow, a woodland, you will never see any bark mulch. No plant evolved to grow in bark mulch. This is a completely human invented thing. But they did evolve to grow in community. They did evolve to grow together, like this image. Again, this image is at the Allen Centennial Garden on campus. Olbrich and Madison as well gardens this way. So if you want to see this play out in action, you can certainly visit those places and see more schemes like this and how they grow and how they evolve. Secondly, this brown material, you know, a lot of us are entering spring cleanup mode. It's getting warm. We're really ready to move outside. And I know we're just sort of desperate and ready to do something. And I very much understand that. However, there is a real, first of all, an aesthetic benefit to leaving brown material through the winter. Because again, there is no natural mechanism which cleans out our gardens every year. And so leaving this material provides habitat for overwintering insects, food for birds, and again, it can visually be interesting. Instead of just looking at flat, blank snow, we can see these seed heads and grasses in movement that really keep us entertained for an extended period. But especially this point where we're at right now in spring, this is where a lot of, again, birds and pollinators will use this material to build nests, to lay their eggs. And if we remove all of this, we're essentially saying we don't want you here. So by leaving this material, we're encouraging beneficial wildlife to stay in our gardens and in our landscapes. And sort of what you're looking for is when temperatures are consistently above 50 degrees, and that's in the evening, not during the day. So when temperatures are consistently above 50 degrees in the evening, that's when we're in the clear to start cleaning things up. Sort of the, you know, insects and birds have gone through what they need to go through. And if we want to, for our own benefit, tidy up the garden, that's sort of our moment where we're in the clear. And again, brown, I think, can be exceptionally beautiful. Forms, textures, and again, I have a whole other talk called Brown as a Color too, because even looking at these images, we can see that brown is just not one color. There's really a whole palette of things that we can work with. And the final one that I want to mention is that this idea of bad soil. And I hear gardeners, again, of all experiences, sort of refer to their soil as good or bad. And typically, if you have sand and gravel or heavy clay, sort of the left and the right of this image, that's usually when people say, well, my soil is bad, or they bemoan that, oh, it's just so much to work with, or I have to bring in compost, or I have to amend it, or it's just not worth gardening. You know, sort of traditional horticulture has taught us that good soil is sort of this soil in the middle. It's what we call loamy. It's higher in organic material. It's easy to work. It drains freely. It doesn't hold water, but it also doesn't drain too quickly. But when I say all of these things, it's with a big asterisk, because there is a plant somewhere in the world that has evolved to grow in each of these conditions. Now, if you're doing vegetables, yes, the soil in the middle, that loamy, easy to work soil, is what you want. Vegetables are annuals typically. They need to do a lot of growing in one season. They have to flower, they have to fruit, they have to put out seeds. There's a lot of energy that goes into that. And so the soil is where a lot of that energy comes from. But if you're gardening for wildlife, if you're gardening to remove lawn and to make your life easier and simpler, having soil on the left or the right, either clay or sand, is not a bad thing at all. You know, there are plants that have evolved to grow beautifully in those conditions, and they will thrive if they right plant, right place. So matching those plants to the condition you have will pay off dividends, because they will thrive, you will be happier, and you won't be bringing in dump trucks of compost every year to sort of, again, work against this uphill battle. So that is what we have this morning. So again, the sort of getting started primer. You know, we're going to move into questions now, but if you want to follow along, again, with my work, again, send me any questions that, you know, 3 days from now, you wake up in the middle of the night saying, I forgot to ask this. Here's how to find me. Are on my website here, the Instagram handle, and of course, email. Feel free to reach out anytime. And next week, we'll be back, same time, same place, with seed starting is what we'll cover next week. But now I think we're going to open it up to questions again that either you have or that you've sent in. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Jack, what do we have? Who's first up?
Well, we got a couple of really good questions in the past few days by email. And I think we'll give folks in the community room here an opportunity to load things into the chat if they have questions. But in the meantime, I think we should address those that have already come in, especially because they kind of build on your mention of, you know, cherishing the brown. And I think the first one is a lot of people have questions about this winter spring transition. So I know you've touched on that already, but can you address what kind of things the many raised bed gardeners may want to be thinking about at this point?
Sure. So if you're if you're gardening in raised beds, again, which is great for growing many things, especially again if you you know, they could be plopped on top of concrete if you don't have an actual in-ground place to grow. They can compensate for poor soil. Again, if you have contaminants in your soil, they sort of raise you up above that. But also, again, because they're a more controlled growing environment, because we've built them, we've constructed them. It still is not a bad idea to do a soil test probably every spring, because you may still need to incorporate some organic material. You may still need to balance out nutrients, especially if it's an older raised bed. If you've been gardening in it for, you know, more than maybe 3 or 4 years, it's maybe time to do a little tune-up and just know that everything is still sort of humming along the way that it should. You know, also typically if you're gardening in a raised bed, you've probably brought in compost or soil to fill it at some point. You're probably not growing with soil you've dug out of your yard necessarily, which again would sort of defeat the purpose of avoiding contaminants and things like that. But you know, we're sort of now thinking that you know, rototilling and tilling our gardens isn't necessarily the best practice for maintaining a healthy soil structure. So that sort of breaks up and destroys a lot of the microbes and fungal networks that really grow in our soil and help our soil process nutrients and move water and move air and atmosphere. A better way to prepare our soil is take what we call, probably most of us refer to it as a pitchfork, but it's actually called a digging fork. And so a digging fork has wider tines and thicker tines. A true pitchfork is going to have almost like pencil thin round tines on it. And the pitchfork is for, you know, straw and leaves and lighter things, versus a digging fork, you actually will basically plunge straight down into the soil, wiggle it back and forth a couple of times, and then repeat that every probably 4 to 6 inches. And that way you open up your soil, you help it to, again, sort of breathe again and help air and nutrients penetrate deep, but you're not completely disturbing and tilling everything over. The other benefit of that is weed seeds are triggered to grow by light. So as you till your garden, you're bringing new weed seeds to the surface, which again makes more work for us. Why do we want to work more? Let's make this easy. So by using the sort of soil fork aeration method, we can reduce the amount of weed seeds we're bringing to the surface. And again, that just makes our life easier long-term, you know, for the rest of the growing season. When it actually comes to planting, of course, you will be digging holes, you will be, you know, sort of putting things in, but that's still less disruptive than totally turning over all the soil. And really the only reason, you know, the only, I would say, quasi benefit of doing that is it's, you know, you can sort of plant with your hands. It's so easy to work. But I'd say the benefits of no-till are probably higher than tilling.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ben. And then, kind of related to that, there's a question that came in regarding compost piles. So, what do we want to do in terms of making sure they're active again as quickly as possible after winter?
So compost thrives on sort of, there's three big things that helps compost to thrive. And the first, or four, I'm sorry. The first is air. And so essentially when you're composting, think of it like you're burning a candle, or maybe if you have a fireplace or a fire pit, it needs oxygen in order for that decomposition process to really move. And so of course, over winter with snow, things settle down. If you just get in there again with a digging fork, might, depending on how heavy and old your compost is, a digging fork or a pitchfork could work well for this. Rotating things over, introducing some new oxygen, that's one of your best ways to really jumpstart the process. The second is looking at your balance of greens and browns, or your wet and dry ingredients. So think about making good compost like you're baking. You have your flour, your sugar, everything, your dries, and then you have those wet ingredients. And sort of a decent rule of thumb is you want about 60% wet ingredients. So that would be things like fresh grass clippings, kitchen scraps, again, anything that still has its original color and has moisture. Versus any of the brown material, which, the thing with this time of year is we have an abundance of browns, and those are all really high in carbon. And so if you have a lot of those materials, rather than adding them directly to your compost pile, you could set them aside and incorporate them later in the season as you start to generate more green and wet materials. But don't overload your compost with too much high carbon material first thing in spring. Third is to add a little bit of moisture. If your compost pile is dry, again, maybe if it has more browns and carbon in it, you can take the garden hose, you can take a watering can, just soaking it down and wetting it a little bit also helps to sort of accelerate that process. And the fourth piece of it is, as you do begin to incorporate new ingredients, whether they're browns or greens, the smaller the pieces, the better. So they will break down more quickly, more efficiently. If you have, say, ornamental grass as you're cutting down, you just throw the whole thing in there. It's just good. The more surface area you can provide for microbes and things to sort of really get in and start, breaking things down, the quicker things will break down, generally speaking. So again, think about it. Again, you're sort of reigniting the fire, more or less. And the final thing too could be, if you have space to do this and you aren't already, thinking about a 2 or 3 sort of staged compost system, where maybe your oldest compost is in this first bin, your newer compost is maybe over here, and you're sort of always working on a batch, which just gives you a little bit more flexibility and ability to sort of, because later in the season we're going to have a lot of grass clipping, we're going to have a lot more greens than we have browns later into the year. So again, stockpiling those brown materials now could come in really handy later in the season as well.
Okay, great. I think then a lot of folks are also kind of, in a place where maybe their biggest challenge from last season were pests. So I know that you've talked a little bit about the jumping worm concern, but maybe you can get into that a little bit more. And also just kind of elaborate on ways that we can prepare ourselves and our gardens to have a less pest concerns this season.
Sure. So jumping worms, I'll sort of hit first. And the first thing I'll say is, if the UW Extension has some amazing resources about this out there already. So I'm just sort of going to do a really quick hit on them, but I certainly would encourage folks to go deeper and read a bit more. That's probably your best source to go for this information. But the first thing to know is to just know if you have jumping worms to begin with, sort of doing a self-diagnostic essentially. So the telltale sign that you have them is by observing your soil's texture. And so if you're out gardening and you're doing some things this spring and you start to notice that the first couple inches of your soil has like a coffee grounds consistency, so little pellets, very easy to move in and dig, that is their calling card, are those coffee ground like consistency. Now, jumping worms, the adults are not able to overwinter in our climate. We get too cold, so they die off. But essentially they will restart their life cycle every year from the eggs that are in the soil. And the eggs are so small, you cannot, you could never pick them out. Don't even pretend that's an option. But again, if you have jumping worms already, the biggest thing is to not share plants from your garden with others, sort of keeping them in line. If you're walking on your soil, you can try putting down like a 2x6 or a plywood or something, so that, which is also good for reducing soil compaction. We don't want to compact our soil, which sort of prevents plants from growing really well, but that also keeps dirt from clogging into your shoes. Because another way that jumping worms can migrate is through clods of dirt, and again, those little eggs that could lodge in the bottom of your shoes. But again, if you don't have a board or plywood or anything like this, or don't have room to do that, washing off the bottom of your shoes, banging them off, having one of those sort of shoe brushes by your back door, before you walk to your neighbors, before you maybe walk to your front yard, if that's jumping worm free. So the first biggest thing is recognizing sort of their calling card and not spreading them are the couple of the biggest things. With that in mind, of course, the reverse applies, where if you're accepting donated plants from others, again, I almost wouldn't do it if you're within Madison, or, it's just, unless you already have the jumping worms and you're willing to take that risk, I would not accept donated plants. Sourcing from a reputable nursery or garden center, which again, all of them in Madison, I would have, all of them, they're growing up off the ground. There's really no way for the worms to get in there. You should be pretty clear and safe. But the next way that they could be introduced is through mulch. So if you're getting mulch or compost or anything like that this spring, exercising caution about where that comes from. So if it's something that's been bagged, if you're buying them in bags, which isn't great because of course, the plastic, but if you need if you have a really large garden, you need a lot of mulch. If mulch has been in contact with the soil for too long, and it's a place where jumping worms are known to be, they could be in that mulch and come with you, and come with the mulch. So ask your nursery, your garden center. Other places, mulch is stored on, concrete or gravel, and there you're again, it's not a surefire proof, but it's probably a safer bet than if it was stored on bare soil, where they could just crawl right up from the soil into that organic material. And then the final thing, sort of further, if we were deeper into the season and say this was June or July, you might also be able to recognize the adults of the worms. And full confession, there are ways to visually identify sort of the band on them, that they have a specific color. Again, the extension has great information on that, but I find the better way to identify them is based on their behavior. So jumping worms are social. So if you find one, you're going to find a whole mass of them sort of all riding together. Not very pleasant. If you're uncovering things like red wigglers or night crawlers, which are sort of the worms we're more familiar with in our spaces, those are more solitary. So if you find one, they're probably going to be on their own. They're not going to be in this sort of big mass. But also the reason they're called jumping worms, they thankfully do not actually jump out of the ground, because that would just be terrifying. But they do wriggle a lot. So when you do disturb them, they really start to move and flail and flip around. So those, the social nature, the soil texture, and that behavior are sort of the three ways to know if you have them. If you already have them, the Arboretum and Extension and many others in the area have been looking into ways to control them and mitigate them. I don't know if they've come up with anything yet, but I know that's being actively researched. I know heat is one way that can kill them. So, if you are getting compost, making sure that compost has been heated up to the proper temperature, because that will kill the adults and the eggs. So essentially a way to sort of purify things coming in. But again, if they're already in your soil, even something like laying down black plastic, because these worms only live in the top 1 to 2 inches of soil, and something like black plastic, essentially, again, it's like baking your soil in place. But that only really works great if you've got some full sun. If you're in shade and it really won't heat it up, that may not be an option. But again, I would encourage checking out Extension and Arboretum for probably the latest on those.
Is that a common question that you would ask your bulk provider? Like, how would you ask the guy who you buy your mulch from?
Sure. I imagine it's probably becoming a more common question. I don't think it's anything we would have asked in the past, but even just saying something like, can you tell me about where this was sourced? And even just being upfront, you don't have to well, don't dodge the question. Be like, I'm worried about jumping worms. How can you tell me that this is jumping worm free? if it's something like bark or wood chips that either, and again, if those were imported, I'm not the world's greatest insect expert, but certainly things could move in from those. But if it was freshly created, if you're working with, say, an arborist or a tree care company, and they said, well, we just cut down this tree 2 blocks over, ground it up, and now it's on your space, that's fine. I mean, that is going to be clean and clear. And there are companies that will do that. They will just dump a load of bark or wood chips at your place. So maybe if that's kind of mulch you want, going directly to an arborist might be your best choice, because then you just sort of skip the step where it would have extended contact with the soil and be more likely to pick it up. And again, bagged material, as much as I don't love the plastic bags, you're probably pretty safe, because those bags will heat up. They're exposed to the sun. So chances are, even if they were in there, they might have gotten cooked. So.
Well, this is a kind of new threat for me. So, if you get them, are you doomed? Like, is that the end of your yard?
It's certainly not the bigger risk, I think, for jumping worms is natural ecosystems. So, this is one reason that, they were discovered at the Arboretum several years ago. And those types of spaces, woodlands especially, is where ecologists are really focused, because they change, they go through organic matter, the leaf material that falls from trees, more quickly. And that essentially changes, again, the ability of nutrients to cycle through a forest ecosystem the way they're supposed to. For us home gardeners, you might notice things like, because the way they change soil architecture, water might drain more quickly. You might notice plants drying out more readily.
Okay.
So it may mean more frequent irrigation. Something else I've been personally curious about, I don't have any data on this, is if they avoid certain plants versus being more attracted to others. So, typically when we think about building a garden that's resistant to things like squirrels and rabbits and munching herbivores, planting things like salvias and mints and alliums, things that are fragrant and have those sort of essential oils, they tend to avoid. And I'd be curious if that applies to the worms as well. Again, I don't know if there's been research or data on this. But yeah, the biggest thing I would probably watch is things drying out, especially if we have an extended dry spell. But if you plant things with deep taproots, again, native plants, prairie plants that go really deep and far below, you might, that might be one way to sort of, proof your garden against that couple-inch disruption.
Sure. Ben, we only have a few minutes left, but you touched on another question that one of the folks that wrote in wants to know about, and that is rabbits. What can we do? I know everybody thinks they can build a better fence, but do you have ideas?
Yeah, your first and probably best, again, it all really depends on the size you're working in. If it's a fairly small backyard garden, I'd say physical barrier is actually probably your easiest and most inexpensive way to go. You can look for, it would either be called rabbit fencing or sometimes chicken wire probably, but you're looking for something with holes that are about the size of a quarter. Anything larger than that in your fence, and especially baby rabbits, most of them are fur. So if you see a rabbit, you think, well, that can't possibly fit through my fence. Well, it can, because it all just, their actual bodies are kind of small. So, chain link, which is again probably more the size of like a cookie or a traditional chocolate chip cookie, they can just that is not rabbit proof. They can move through that. So the good news is if it's at least about 18 to 24 inches tall, sometimes if they're really desperate and really sort of taking advantage, they will jump over it. But typically if you are in about that 18 to 24 inch height, they won't be able to get in. Also checking if you already have a fenced in lawn or garden, checking underneath, because a lot of times they will sort of go underneath things. So even if you have, say, a picket fence with tiny little gaps, you think, well, they can't possibly get through. But even just an inch or two gap underneath that fence, they can sort of go in and out pretty easily. So doing a perimeter inspection before the season and things start growing, you'll probably see those spots pretty quickly. Aside from that, again, planting things they just don't want to eat if you're gardening for ornamentals, again, mints, alliums, things of that nature.
Can you maybe build a perimeter of mint or something like that would really discourage them from getting in there?
You can certainly try. I've also heard things like marigolds that are fragrant can help to deter. I think the challenge is no two rabbits are the same. You know, to say this always works, it's foolproof, probably isn't. You know, it really depends on your rabbit and how bold they are. If they find a way through, or they do it once and they realize, oh, that wasn't so bad, they might keep coming back. The other thing I've noticed with rabbits in particular is they tend to be attracted to fresh plants from a nursery or a garden center versus things that are already in the ground. And my only theory with this is my personal experience, but my only theory is, you know, when plants are grown in a greenhouse, again, it's a controlled environment and it's in the ideal conditions for that plant. So they're lush, they're happy. You know, when they come into our garden, I swear rabbits can tell when something came out of a garden center versus when something's maybe been in the ground for a year. It's hardier, it's more adapted, it's sort of acclimated to its site, and it may not be as appealing. So especially anything that you're planting new this year, I might, whether it's just a little fence or enclosure around it, giving those new plants a little bit more protection this year. You may not need to do it every year, but especially for year one, even things they're not supposed to eat, if it's freshly planted and it came out of a greenhouse, like it's like they don't care sometimes.
Right.
So again, a little extra protection can be helpful.
I also learned the hard way to not spend all winter throwing your vegetable scraps in the same place that you're trying to get them out of in the
Yes.
summer. Well, thank you for joining us. This is the end of our time, but we'll be back, everyone, next week with seed starting as our topic. We'll get into the rest of the questions that we have here and solicit more questions from you this week. So we hope everyone can come back. And thank you so much, Will, for Ben, for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure. We'll see you next week.
Yes, see you then. See you, everyone. Thank you.